welcome back to the show. If you're new here, I'm Sheen, your host, and welcome back to another satellite episode of the Dream Girl podcast. Today, we're filming from Doha in Qatar. We are in the first ever women-only mosque in the Middle East. Welcome to Al-Mujadilah. I know that when I said women-only mosque, something probably went on in your mind. Whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, you probably thought about some stuff, and I'm sure you have questions. And this is why we're here today, and this is why I'm super excited about this episode. And joining me today, I have Dr. Sohaira Siddiqui, who is the Executive Director of Al-Mujadilah. She's also an Associate Professor at Georgetown, and she is just overall a rock star. She is also a scholar, and she is teaching about Islamic law at university. She's just doing a lot, and she's really helping us reshape how women are contributing to anything when it comes to Islamic studies and the practice and scholarship of Islam. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Sohaira. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. How are you?
Good. I'm truly honored to have you finally on the show today. And my first question for you is just very, very light, you know. If it was up to you to erase one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to Islamic law, which one would it be?
Just one.
Yeah.
I think for me, the challenge has always been who has the misconception. And for Islamic law as a tradition, sometimes the biggest problem is that people outside have misconceptions, but so do people inside. So I would say from an insider perspective, in terms of what I've seen with students, what I've seen with Muslims, the biggest misconception is that Islamic law is static, that, you know, we have a revealed set of laws, which we obviously have the Quran and there's law within the Quran. But then a lot of the laws that we practice in our daily lives actually don't necessarily always come from the Quran. They're coming from juristic interpretation over many, many years. And so the biggest misconception is thinking that the tradition is just rigid and it's this book of laws that you have to follow. It's about what's halal and haram, and there isn't that gray area in between, where when you really start to study, you find that there's so much diversity and so much plurality, and that's where the richness of it comes from.
Wow. Well, this is why we're here today. Honestly, this was my main tagline for the episode, which was how Islam is not static, right? And we're here to talk a little bit about how do we bridge tradition and modern world. But let's take a step back. Let's talk about this beautiful space we're in. So we've had this conversation many times, but for the viewers today, you know, this is the first women-only mosque in the Middle East. Walk us back a few years ago when this all happened. What sparked the idea?
So the project was really part of the vision of Sheikh Moza bint Nasser, who's the chairperson of Qatar Foundation. And I think she's really the visionary behind a lot of the education projects and development projects that we see here in Qatar. And one of the first institutions that was founded within Education City was actually the Faculty of Islamic Studies. And that was really kind of, I think, at the heart of her mission. And within the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies, you have a beautiful masjid, which is called Minaratain. And the initial idea behind the masjid when it was founded was to really be the masjid for Education City. And so it was made in this, you know, beautiful, expansive space. 4,000 or 5,000 people can pray there. And the idea was that both men and women could share that space together. And there was a small space that was made for women in addition if they didn't want to pray in the main space. But very quickly, what ended up happening is that women didn't share in that main space anymore, and they were only praying in the smaller space. And as Education City grew and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, that space just couldn't accommodate the number of women. And in parallel to that, right, so you have the kind of the practical challenge of the number of women that wanted to attend the mosque simply could not be accommodated in the physical space of the mosque. And then in parallel, the other challenge was that as, you know, women were going to university and they were going to have their careers afterwards, and they were developing professionally and they were having families, there were all sorts of questions that women were asking. And there really wasn't a place where those questions were being researched or those questions were meaningfully being engaged with. And so bringing both of those ideas together, it was to almost like reimagine what could a mosque be for women today. It could be both that kind of place of prayer and reflection and spiritual growth, but it could also be that place of learning and dialogue and discussion. And so that's really where the vision came from. So we started kind of thinking about what that looks like about 3 years ago. And then the building was built, and we've been open now almost for a year and a half now. And so it's been a very fast journey from idea to kind of opening.
Wow. And it feels almost surreal that we didn't have this before, right? It's very new. It's 1.5 years old. But what do you think was kind of like stopping us from having a women-only mosque? Was it just not something that was on people's mind?
Well, in some places there were women-only mosques, right? So there's actually like a really rich tradition in China of women's-only mosques. And we actually have a Mujadilah podcast coming out about this, the history of women's...
We'll link it.
With the history of kind of women's spaces. But it was really interesting because when I started speaking about Mujadilah as a mosque for women, depending on who you spoke to, you would get different reactions from different people. So if you were speaking about it to women, for example, in Far East Asia and China, they weren't surprised. They were like, we have a tradition of this. Similarly, Central Asia, I have a friend from Macedonia, and she said that a lot of the mosques when she was growing up, the women carried the keys for the mosques. And usually the men would go to pray and they would come to the women, they'd get the keys. And so she's like, even when men came to the mosques, it was because we let them. So I think it depends on where you go in the Muslim world. Women's only spaces and spaces of education have always existed. But I think, the way Mujadilah is conceived as kind of like a purpose-built women's mosque, integrating education and research and faith, that version of it is new. But it's really built on, I think, this tradition of Muslim women having spaces for themselves, spaces of reflection and prayer. And this is what it looks like for us today.
I love that. And yesterday I posted on my story asking people if they had any questions about a women-only mosque. And overwhelmingly, what came up was the side door to the mosque. And I didn't expect this. I thought of course, there were a lot of questions about how is that possible, but also it was a lot of people saying, I stopped going because I never know where to find the side door to go in for the women's section. And I thought, wow. And then it took me back to when I was in university, when we would go for Jummah, especially on Friday, and we had a dedicated mosque space, and then the girls section was at the back, but we were always crowded, especially Jummah. When it's full, then there's no ladies section anymore. And then it feels so special to walk in here and see that this is purely dedicated to us. And I see the sign that says, "Oh, men at work here today." I was like, I like that.
Just to warn people before they come in that they'll encounter a man.
Exactly. So I like that this has happened. But was there any pushback that you got when you were trying to set this up?
There definitely was kind of conversation about why is this needed, because of the fact that, it is new in some regards, right? Purpose-built Muslim women's mosque in the Middle East. There was questions in terms of what is the religious basis for this? So is it necessary? Is it permissible? These were kind of the big questions that people were asking, and they continue to ask. And, for us at Mujadilah, we think it's a great opportunity to have the conversation, right? That really what we are trying to do here is we feel very deeply rooted in the Islamic tradition, and at the same time, it's trying to meaningfully serve the needs of Muslim women, which we see as a very positive thing. And so I think it's very natural when there is something new in any tradition, religious tradition, to start asking questions about should we do this, should we not do this? But the way we kind of approach it at Mujadilah is these are opportunities for us to have the conversation about what are the needs of Muslim women, right? So, we've run 150 programs, almost all at full registration. So that means there is a need, right? And these programs aren't running elsewhere. So to the extent that we are fulfilling the needs of Muslim women, we're doing something good.
So let's address the elephant in the room. That's the question everybody asked me was, is that possible? Can you have a woman imam? Is it possible for other women to pray behind other women? Can you explain this to us, please?
So, like I said at the beginning, Islamic law is very diverse. So this is also another, I don't say it's a debated issue, but it's an issue that has multiple opinions. So can women lead other women in prayer? We know that the wives of the Prophet ﷺ led other women in prayer. And from that, the majority of the legal schools will say that women can lead other women in prayer. The exception to that is the Hanafi legal school, which is prominent in South Asia. And so that legal school says, no, maybe it's best for women to pray separately. And so what we try to do at Mujadilah is the masjid here is very, very open. So if we have, for example, a large lecture, the adhan goes off, we invite women to pray. There is always a designated female that will lead the prayer. And if people want to pray with her, they pray with her. If they don't want to pray with her, they don't necessarily have to. And then for Jummah and for Ramadan, we have a male imam that comes in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've heard how amazing Ramadan is here. How was it this year?
This year, mashallah, I think it exceeded all of our expectations. We have the masjid space, which accommodates about 800. And then we extended this library space actually to be a secondary masjid space. And then that accommodated another 400. And then the busiest nights of Ramadan, we were praying outside.
Wow.
And so it was a really, really powerful, I think, month. And just those last nights, especially for the entire team, it was so emotional because I always say community work takes so much from you. You're constantly engaging with people. People have multifaceted needs. There's problems that you're constantly hearing. As you know, you get negative feedback oftentimes. It's not all good. And so we carry that all throughout the year. And at least for me, and I know for other members of the team, there was something about Ramadan that was that like cathartic moment where you just felt like this is why we do it. And so it was really special.
Oh, can you walk us through that moment? You told me the story already, and I know how beautiful it is. I would love for you to share it.
So it was the 27th, and it was, mashallah, one of those nights where the women had extended all the way outside. So we had put additional prayer mats outside. And, the beautiful thing about the team is you put the women first, right? You put all of the other women who are coming in first. And so all of us were kind of running around and getting prayer mats for people. And, our legs were tired, but you just keep moving. And then we would take turns in terms of who prays Tarawih, just to make sure that there's always someone there. Yeah, for space, and just to make sure if anything happens, somebody's there to help. And then, so it came to the end, and it was witr. And so a couple of myself and a couple other members of the team, we just quickly grabbed some prayer mats. We sat down by the 2 olive trees. And the imam started making dua. And dua on the 27th is always so powerful. And then in the middle of the dua, he started making dua for the women of Mujadilah, like who work here. And I remember, like, I got very emotional. I was crying. The people, like, were crying next to me. And it just felt so nice in that moment for it to be recognized and for all of the women to be there. So this last Ramadan, I would say that was the most special moment for me.
Wow, that's so beautiful. And I always feel like in spaces built by women for women, that community feeling is always super strong.
Yeah.
And I think all of you are so busy and engrossed into making this a special experience for everyone else. It must have been lovely for you to finally see that, actually, people like this.
Yeah, people like this, and we get a dua, and and it was just it was a moment of, like, I think, collective recognition, but also, like I said, it just, when you carry all of that work, and you sometimes you have conflict at work, and there's challenges, and there's good days, and there's bad days, and you carry that every single day, and you wait for those moments where it's made meaningful and it's made special, right? That's why in universities they have graduations at the end, right? So, we're not a university, so for us, I feel like that moment is Ramadan.
It was your graduation.
Yeah, it was our graduation.
What are you going to do when Ramadan is in summer?
I don't like to think that far. I've calculated it that I think it's like 21 years, and so
no way,
it's something crazy.
We
like
have
that.
a long time.
We have a long time.
Oh, okay,
So we have a long time. So
nothing to worry about just yet.
Not yet. Inshallah, it's the job of another team, another director.
But okay, tell us a little bit about the space, because I know there's the library, the cafe, the study space here, all the rooms. Tell us a little bit about the architecture of the place.
Yeah, so the idea behind the space is for really, and I think it goes back to what you said, the main question people were asking was the side entrance question, right?
Yeah.
And many Muslim women experience mosques by kind of coming in and trying to figure out, where do I go? Where's the mosque? Where am I sitting? Where's the prayer mats? Where all of these
usually
different
in the
things.
back, in the side room.
Yeah, so you're constantly almost like searching for where you need to go and what you need to do. So we kind of took that experience and reimagined it and said, what would it look like and feel like for you just to walk into the space and be in it? And so when you walk into Mujadilah, the first thing you see is kind of just the masjid is open. So much so that I remember the first month or two that we were open, people would come in and they would say, where do I pray? And, staff would always say, you pray in this direction, because again, the qibla is, the mihrab is kind of more modern. It's just like a beautiful marble slate. The carpet is unique, so it doesn't stand out immediately as what you're used to as kind of just like lines in the carpet for a mosque. But it's lovely because you're just in the space when you enter. And then we have, as you said, we have cafe, we have classrooms. And so we try to use indoor and outdoor spaces. When it's winter, then we try to be outside. And then we have a nice library area here and the multi-purpose room. And we found that women use the space in all sorts of different ways. So we see it being used more now for like remote working, for meetings. We get contacted by a lot of groups to say, can we just rent the space? So it's become more than just a space in which we do programs, but it's now starting to feel like a space where the community is coming and saying, oh, we can use it like this and we can do this. And so that's really nice to see.
Yeah. And even in the past 2 days, I keep seeing people coming in just to work from here, which is, and it's just free for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Anyone can just walk in and use it.
Exactly. So we open at 8 a.m., close in the evening at around 8 to 9 p.m. And so if you want to just come and spend the day here, it's really easy to do it.
Oh, amazing. And you run 150 programs so far. So tell us a little bit about them.
we break them down into cycles.
Yeah.
So in the past, what we did is we had lots of conversations with Muslim women just to understand what type of programs do they want, right? We didn't want it to just have the programs you would expect to see in a mosque, which is, of course, the Quran programs, the Hadith programs. But really, we wanted to design programs that just addressed all of the needs of Muslim women. And so in our kind of focus group and conversations, we identified like 3 kind of core needs. One was a need for community and that sense of belonging within a group. And it wasn't about, I want to learn X, Y, and Z, but it was, I want to be with people. And that was, it was really powerful, but and I think it really motivated us to think about how do we use this space to create that sense of belonging and community. And I think we're seeing this more and more that, you know, people's happiness isn't connected to their paychecks necessarily. It's connected to the depth of their relationships. And so how do we create programs, social programs, community programs of belonging? That was one challenge. And then we created programs for that. The second area that we identified was what we call developmental, which is really programs that are focused on the overall well-being of Muslim women, whether they're classes on financial literacy or classes on, maternal health, classes on, family relationships, public speaking, confidence building. So just anything that we feel like can really complement a woman in her self-growth and development. And then the last bulk of programs are the religious programs. And what we try to do in the religious programs is, of course, offer, the hifz programs and tajweed and things related to the Quran and Hadith, but also ask the question of what would give Muslim women a deeper sense of attachment and confidence in their religion. That one of the challenges we saw is that Muslim women oftentimes feel like they can't participate in religious conversations because they doubt the knowledge that they have. So how can we create not just 1 or 2 programs, but how can we create entire learning pathways so that a woman could come into Mujadilah and feel like, okay, I've now taken these courses over a year, 2 years, 3 years, and now I feel like I can engage in my religious tradition. I can teach it to my children. I can, if I hear a lecture, I can ask questions and I can respond. So, we're not trying to create scholars in kind of the traditional sense, but we are trying to create women who really feel that depth of connection to one another and to Islam.
Wow, okay. So many things to talk about here. The first part, I find it so interesting that, because, I've spent most of my life in non-Muslim countries, and there is always that sense of there's a lack of community when it comes to Muslims in general, not just even Muslim women, but of course it's easier for the men because they have the mosque to go to every day. But it's interesting to see that even in Muslim countries, this happens, isn't it? And it's crazy, but that's one. And the second part is what you said about a lot of times women shy away from participating in Islamic conversations. And this is something I've noticed recently because I've started posting a bit more content about Islam. And then a lot of women would send me DMs to tell me what they thought about it.
Interesting.
Or how it challenged their thoughts. And it would be very, very well thought out messages, but it's never public. And it's always sent to me privately. And they always say, I didn't want to put it out there unless I'm not sure. There's always a little caveat about, I'm not sure about this, but this is what I want to say. And it's great that now there is this space where, we're trying to at least give them all the tools that they need in order to be able to address this. But based on all the programs that you have run, has there been any any outcomes that you're very proud of, or anything that you would want to share with us in terms of what did you notice on how these women are graduating from these courses and taking it out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. Like, everyone loves to measure impact, right?
Yes.
I feel like this is the business school side of you. It's like, show me impact, show me the numbers. I'm trying to think, like, there's many ways I think I can answer this. One, I do see that, you start to see the birth of a community here, right? So you see this in certain classes. So, for example, we have a hadith class that comes in a series. So you have kind of introduction to hadith, and then you have advanced hadith, and you have hadith about the life of the Prophet ﷺ and his family relationships, and then hadith on contemporary issues. And those kind of 4 classes, you see women take those classes almost together as a group. And then the conversations within the classroom end up developing. So you can really see that when you start to kind of build knowledge, like from step 1, step 2, step 3, and onwards, that you do get to that place of kind of religious confidence, or that place where at least women feel a lot more engaged with these contemporary conversations. But if I was to say maybe like one interesting case is, so there was a student that had come in the beginning who was a researcher, and she had come from one of the institutes here, Doha Institute, and she was just interested in the fact that Mujadilah existed. Somebody told her Mujadilah existed. And so she was doing, at that point, I think, conflict resolution. I don't remember, but she was on the track to kind of go back to do diplomacy. And she came and she started taking some of the courses, and she just really liked Mujadilah. She ended up changing her thesis to do her thesis on Mujadilah.
Oh, wow.
And then now she wants to do social work instead, because she said she's found that just coming and speaking with women and engaging with women and working in the community, she's seen it as such a powerful model for her that she feels like, as opposed to doing kind of work in politics, she feels like grassroots community work is now where she wants to go. So I think it's those individual stories that for us, really make the work meaningful.
Of course, it's moving the needles for at least one person, right?
Yeah.
And also, now that you've mentioned it, we haven't addressed the meaning behind the name. So I know you love that story, so tell us.
Yeah, so Mujadilah, of course, is from surah in the Quran, Surah Al-Mujadilah, which is the story of a woman, Khawla, who goes to the Prophet ﷺ after being divorced. And it's a pre-Islamic form of divorce known as zihar. When you say to your wife that you are to me like the back of my mother. And that was a way of divorcing a woman in pre-Islamic Arabia. And, she had bore him many children. He was actually a famous companion who fought with the Prophet ﷺ in many battles. And so for her to even go and kind of make a public complaint about him was already quite a powerful act in and of itself. And so she goes to the Prophet ﷺ, and the story is quite beautiful because despite being the kind of vessel of the lawgiver is ultimately Allah, right? So he waits for revelation, and revelation comes, and it's the beginning of Surah Al-Mujadilah, which is, verily God has heard the speech of the woman who has come to you pleading her case. And, in the Arabic, it's even more powerful when you know the story, because it starts with qad, which is kind of, it puts a lot of emphasis in the Arabic, or the verb that comes after it. And so it says, God has heard the speech of this woman. And then it goes on to say that this form of divorce was not permissible. And so it's this beautiful moment, a historical moment in which, as a woman identifies a problem, but she also seeks the solution from within her religious tradition. And she seeks it with confidence, and she seeks it with clarity. And she gets her resolution. And, we've spoken about this before, that one of the beautiful things about the stories of women in the Quran is they're all so diverse, but they all come back to one fundamental point, which is these women turn to Allah. And they're so, despite, the challenge that they're going through in that moment, they are so clear in that turning to Allah. It's so powerful. And so when we were thinking about, 10, 20 years from now, what do we want the women of Mujadilah to be? What do we want them to look like? We were thinking we want them to be women who find the issues and then who find the solutions from within their religious tradition. And so it made sense to call it Al-Mujadilah, which literally, if you want to translate it, it's the woman who pleads, the woman who discourses, the woman who asks. And so we hope that through everything, that's what we eventually create.
Well, that's such a beautiful story. And I love what you said. And yes, this is a conversation we've had where in the Quran, it's always women going back to God with so much surety, being like, this is my problem, solve it. Yeah. And I think that's something that in the modern world, we've started to shy away from. And there's a lot of kind of like putting the onus on ourselves of like, where did I go wrong? What can I fix? And how do you think we can guide, especially younger women, better in terms of getting them back on that track of, always go back to the root, basically?
I mean, I think a lot of it is we have to cultivate kind of within ourselves almost a type of spiritual humility. So much of modern society is about, and I love the word empowerment, but so much of it is directed at the self. And the idea is that I have a series of needs, I have a series of desires, and I can fulfill them. And that's what makes me empowered. Whereas I think within the religious tradition, it's you have all of these capacities. They've all been given to you by God. And you can nurture those capacities because they have been given to you by God. And then the ultimate kind of, opening and the ultimate recognition and the path forward is kind of, there is an element of facilitation to it. You have to turn to Allah, you have to pray, you have to make your intention, you have to be sincere. So there's something about the self, but there's also crucially in that something about others, something about service, something about Allah. And so I think to the extent that we can bring all of those things together, that's what truly, I think, uplifts people. And so for, young women who are oftentimes receiving these messages that are so directed at the self, I think the best thing that we can do is actually slowly start to unpack that a little bit, because all of us exist in a complex web of relationships, right? Nobody is really just themselves as like one single individual, right? As much as we want to be an island, we can't be, right? We are by definition connected to human beings. And so to that extent, I feel like the more that we can impress upon that and remind women that, they engage in these kind of relationships and they engage with Allah, and that is really what's going to allow them to, as I said, be uplifted.
I love what you just talked about. And one thing that we wanted to talk to you about today on this podcast is because I've said this to you many times, is that I feel like whenever things happen that I disagree with, my response is not great.
Shut down.
I will shut them down. I don't know how to explain very clearly, but you have this talent of putting things into perspective and giving them, whoever it is that you're talking to, painting a picture that's relevant to them that immediately causes that switch to flip. So that's why I want to ask you this question as well today. I feel like obviously you're teaching Islamic law, you deal with a lot of young people. I'm sure none of this is new to you, but a lot of times whenever there is anyone, especially women, who are trying to, demystify or challenge the stereotypes that comes with Islamic law, or even what tradition and culture has turned Islamic law into, they can be branded as rebellious or as people who are trying to modernize the religion. But how do you see this?
It's a loaded question.
I came from a long way.
Yeah. I'm trying to piece all of that together now. So women as rebellious,
yes.
and then the question of modern as well.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a couple of different questions in there. Let me start with the second part.
Sure.
I think we have a challenge about, we constantly create this dichotomy between tradition and modernity. And we always feel like Islam is tradition and traditional, and then you have modernity as something else, and we need to somehow reconcile these two. Whereas when I read Islamic history, when I look at Muslim civilization in the 7th century, in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and I keep going on, I always think that in that moment, I would have thought I'm living in a really modern religion, right? That our notion of modernity or modern as the space that we now occupy is really relative, right? So if you're talking about the 11th, 12th century and you look at Muslim societies in terms of how much they developed economically, socially, politically, all of those different things. They were modern societies. And part of what made them kind of modern societies was the ability of Islamic intellectual thought to always adapt to whatever the circumstances were. And what makes any intellectual tradition viable is its ability to adapt. Once an intellectual tradition stops being able to answer new questions, stops being relevant to the lived realities of people's lives, stops being able to kind of think about what are the issues that are coming up in the future, it's no longer an intellectual tradition. It's just it's just a set of books then. And so for me, the biggest problem kind of in our way that we kind of approach it is that we always think that, you know, we need to make this big reconciliation. Whereas I think the real challenge is we need to start seeing and understanding Islam as always having been very dynamic. And even you have this like hikmah in wahi, in revelation itself, that there could have been just one moment of revelation. It didn't have to be 23 years of verse by verse, sometimes chapter by chapter, surah by surah. There is a kind of a lesson in that itself to say that, you know, if we're trying to adapt to society, if we're trying to change ourselves as individuals, if we're trying to establish kind of new laws, we have to be responsive, right? Things are going to change and adapt. And this is the story of Khawla as well. The law changed. And so I think for women today, when, you know, we start asking these questions and people, you know, want to say, oh, you know, these women are westernized or they're being modernized or they're, you know, they're not thinking about their families and they're not thinking about their culture. I think the best thing that we can do as women is actually understand our own history better. And that even in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, his wives were different archetypes. And I have a friend that actually wrote a paper about this and presented at Jadal. But you have the woman who was out there working, and you have the housewife, and you have, you know, the friend, and you have all of these different models of what it means to be a practicing woman. And the more that I think we have a deeper understanding of these kind of diverse feminine archetypes, and the more we understand Islamic history as being dynamic and responsive, then when someone comes to us and says, you know, you're rebelling, then all of a sudden you're so confident and sure that you're not, because you have this history and you can paint the picture and you can think about not just, you know, the wives of the Prophet, but, you know, the women in the 8th century and the 10th century and the 12th century. And I always say to my students, whether at Georgetown or here, you can't go to any major Muslim city in the world and not see the tangible impact of Muslim women. Whether we're talking about Muslim women building mosques, whether we're talking about them patroning gardens or, you know, patroning bathhouses or libraries, some women were literally the architects of entire cities. And so it's a matter of us understanding that history better. And once we do that, then you realize actually you're not rebellious. You're actually just following in their footsteps.
Yeah. And even now that you were saying, I started thinking, even when we think about Hawa, right? The first ever woman, she did everything herself. She started everything and we come from her. So then why is this anything new or modern that we are trying to set out without any blueprint? And I think that's such an interesting point. And I agree with you. There is so much learning to do, so much information for us all to absorb so that we become more confident in what we're doing. And that will take some time, but
it will take a lot of time. But you know, what I also say to my students is a lot of this is really subtle, internalized Islamophobia and neocolonialism. And I know that's very controversial to say.
No, it's not.
But I really believe that because, you know, when I go back and I read some of the arguments for why colonial power is justifying going in and occupying the Muslim world, it was the laws are barbaric, the women are oppressed, you know, Islam is not modern, we need to liberate people. And it's almost uncanny for, you compare those kind of arguments to some of the arguments are made for the exact same type of occupation that's happening in the Muslim world today, and you don't see any difference. And then you see some of the arguments that Muslims themselves are making, and that's when you realize actually that the colonial project was so unbelievably successful. in terms of its intellectual occupation and cultural occupation. Generational, that colonial power may have left, but the remnants of thinking about our religions and our cultures and our art and our architecture and our music and our civilizations as, traditional and archaic, and then what we live in now as beautiful and modern. Like, for me, it is so, like, it breaks my heart sometimes. And I feel that a big part of the challenge is just breaking that down and understanding that many of our own, it goes back to your question on misconceptions, many of our own misconceptions are not actually a reflection of our lived experience of religion, but how we have been talked to and talked at about our religion from the outside. And I think that is the real challenge that we have to address.
I agree. I think even for me, growing up, you realize how much unlearning you have to do based on what you absorbed without realizing in terms of where do we stand, what does it mean to be a woman in Islam. But see, now that we're on this topic...
The can of worms has been opened.
Yeah.
It's been unleashed.
We can't go back now. I forgot my line of questions. But, when you think about this, the narrative that I hear constantly, also you studied in the West as well, so did I. And when you're there, the number of times I got into conversations, which are, intellectual conversations, where they're like, how can you believe in Islam? Or they will assume that because they get along with me, they like me, that I am a different kind of Muslim. Yeah. I am not the general Muslim. And that's why then there's that conversation of, how can you be part of a religion that really does not serve women, or that the women are oppressed? And that conversation is still very much there today. Yep. Whenever we see the headlines, whatever you see, you can see it in people's eyes, when they see a Muslim woman that, oh, she's oppressed. But how do you approach that whenever someone asks you that question? Or because I want to be able to answer like you do and not with aggression. So
I answer with aggression too.
A little bit. But how do you explain to somebody that Islam is not oppressive to women?
See, I don't engage with these people. This is how I address this. Yeah, I just go and talk to my students, which is you have a captive audience, so it's very different. I've made it like my intention not to deal with Islamophobes. So I'm trying to think, how would I answer that question if someone comes and says, does Islam oppress women? Most of the time, those people really have no basis but a few television shows and a few headlines about the oppression of women. And so for me, the first question would be, well, how do you define oppression of women? And if they say, okay, well, it's a matter of education, then here's 50 women who are highly educated, some who are Nobel laureates, right? If it's a matter of they're not allowed to work. Well, again, some of the first female presidents in the world came from the Muslim world, countries, not European countries. If it's a matter of they don't have, access to healthcare, then, here's all of the cases in which actually the healthcare outcomes in the Muslim world are better than healthcare outcomes in other places. So lots of times it's just a sloppy word. And I think people love to use this idea of Muslim women are oppressed, even when it comes to something like hijab, right?
Yes.
Now you have so many studies that show just like the impact of the hypersexualization of women on young girls, on boys, and married couples, right? So even this idea that, Muslim women are oppressed because they wear the hijab, there's a way to flip the script and say, okay, well, why does covering yield oppression? Why do you think that that's a one-to-one? Do you have any study on that? Whereas I've got some studies on the opposite, where actually doing the complete opposite of covering can lead to a bunch of social challenges. So I think sometimes it's opening up that conversation for how we define these things, and then also being willing to accept that, yes, sometimes people have used religion in a way that has resulted in bad outcomes for people. And sometimes those people are women.
Yeah.
And I think we have to accept that as well, because we don't want to seem like, there is no problem, right? Because there is a problem in some Muslim societies where women aren't being given access to education, where women aren't being, where they're not allowed to work, or there's still child marriages happening, or all of these issues. And I think the more that we as Muslims can also own that as a reality, the more that we can also start saying, how are we going to create a solution for that? So part of it, and I've seen this challenge, is, we're ready with our talking points about how to say we're not oppressed, but where are our talking points about how do we resolve the situation in which women are being oppressed, and do so in a way that, again, recognizes Islamic history, recognizing, colonial history and that impact, and then trying to say, okay, this is how we're approaching it from a much more religiously engaged and socially engaged perspective.
Sohaira, my first recollection of a conversation with you, which I immediately afterwards called everyone to tell them about this.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's a good thing, don't worry. It was because I told you that a lot of times people are very judgmental towards me, especially online, when they will be kind of like assessing and judging how Muslim I am. And then what you told me that day was a very simple thing. And you said, you should feel bad for people who carry their religion as a burden and they use it as a stick to hit everyone who's not performing the way they think they should be. And that has stayed with me for a very long time, because that was such a clear vision of how to see people who use religion as a way to basically oppress or persecute other Muslims. And I think that's a big problem we have when it comes to the Muslim world as well, is that we tend to be very harsh on each other. Yeah. and see this again, this is a question I have for you, is that we do also say that in our religion you should correct your brothers and sisters whenever you think that they might be doing something wrong, but there is a way to do that. But where do you draw the line between being judgmental and kind of like saying something for the goodness of the other person? How do you navigate that?
I don't know. That's a tough one. Like, it goes back to the hadith, ad-dinu nasiha, right? Which is like, religion is good counsel. Like, nasiha is this idea of like, you give good counsel to people. But the thing about nasiha is the counsel has to be good. Like, it has to be kind. It has to be thoughtful. There has to be some type of relationship with that person and understanding before you give that counsel. So if you simply see somebody and you say, oh, they're doing the wrong thing, and now I'm going to tell them you can't do this or you can't do that, then you're not actually fulfilling that hadith, right? That you have other hadith that says like, you should give your brother and sister 70 excuses, right? So it's about keeping those things in balance of, do I have a relationship with this person that is built on trust and understanding? Are my intentions when I go to that person pure? Do I feel like I have the truth and this person is, misguided?
Am I on my high horses?
Yeah. If I'm on my high horses, I shouldn't. That's not good counsel, right? So I think the most important thing is just making sure, like, what is your own intention and how are you approaching the person when you're going and giving the counsel? And also having that, again, going back to this idea of humility, that you might not have the truth, right? You might be entering into a conversation with somebody as opposed to saying, you need to do this and you need to do this and you need to do this. And I remember that conversation that we had, and, oftentimes people will come to me as well. People might come to you for different reasons. They'll come to me for different reasons and say, you're not doing this and you're not doing this and you're not doing this. And I've received that time and time again. And I always go back to this of like, just to be merciful, right? That they're carrying, and you see it sometimes even in the way that they approach you, there's almost this anger. And the best thing to do, the prophetic way to respond is just mercy and smiles and say
I'll
thank
pray
you.
for you.
Yeah, I'll pray for you and thank you for your counsel. But, and then you have to process it yourself.
Yeah, I think a lot of times it is unsolicited advice and people coming on their high horses. But I agree that if it is right intentions and people that know you and respect you, then it's different. But one thing I want you to share, it just came to mind as well while you were talking about this, is you've told me this story. So again, a lot of women DM me and they send me these messages saying how they really want to work. Either it's their parents that don't let them work or it's their husbands that don't let them work. And even saying the let them is really triggering me. But, have you ever dealt with that conversation where Muslim men feel like women should not be working, and how did you tackle that? Yeah,
it's one of the like FAQs, I would say, of what men say in terms of women, and then also just in general, like you hear this question talked about even in khutbahs sometimes about like, what is the role of women? What should women be doing? This is the big question that people have been asking for such a long time. So I remember I was having a conversation with somebody who was, and I don't like the label conservative, so I don't want to say conservative, but just somebody who had a very clear opinion that women should not be allowed to work. And was saying to me that, it's a problem that I work, and that, I can, encourage other women to work and students and things like that. And so he was asking me like, effectively, like, how do you sleep at night, knowing that you're corrupting society?
Right.
How do you carry the burden of that through your life?
How do you sleep? Soundly.
Yeah. So I remember I said to him, look, I'm going to paint you a picture. Imagine that you are the proud father of 7 beautiful girls. And every single time those girls leave the house, the only people they deal with are men. They go to school when they're young and they have male teachers. They go to PE class and it's male teachers. They graduate school and it's the male principal that's giving them the graduation certificate. They go to university and every single professor they have is a male. Every single time they go to dinner, they're being served by men. Every single time they go on a plane, everywhere they go, all of those little interactions they have throughout their life is only with men. Would you want that for your daughters? Or would you want a world in which there was women that were also caring for them and caring for their development and their education and their growth and having the conversations? And if you want that world where you have the women also there, then you have to accept that women are going to work. And I think a big part of the challenge becomes that, then it's the other women. Let the other women work, but then not the women of my house, because
right.
The women of my house are pious and upright and, taking care of the children. And I always say to people that Islam is a beautiful, expansive tent. And it accommodates, it accommodates you in all of the phases of your life. So if you are in a phase of your life where you want to be with your children and you don't want to work, then beautifully Islam accommodates that. And if you are in a phase of your life where you want to give to the community and you want to educate and you want to, have an impact, then Islam accommodates that. And so the more that we can understand that Islam just doesn't give you one solution, but it gives many, many options. And it's our job to identify what season are we in. And once we identify what season are we in and how can we best serve that season, then I think we're fine. But the problem that we end up having is we're always looking for this black and white, permanent kind of solution for all time and all space and all situations and all contexts. And even within Islamic law, I would love when I would read these texts and they had this like famous legal principle that, the legal ruling changes with the change in time and the change in place. And in my Islamic law class, I always say to my students that, if you look at the Supreme Court of the United States, it has a big statue of Lady Justice. And Lady Justice is blind because the philosophy of the legal system is justice should be blind. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or where you come from or your socioeconomic class. Of course, we know this is a farce, but at least the statue, Lady Justice, is blind. That's not how Islamic law is. Islamic law wants to understand who you are. Where do you live? How old are you? What's your socioeconomic background? How many people are in your family? All of these things would factor into the ruling that you would get from the mufti or the ruling that you would get from the qadi, right, the judge. And so if we understand that the beauty and the strength of Islamic law is its diversity, its ability to accommodate diversity, and its ability to really provide solutions for the diversity of human beings, then I think we would have a much richer kind of intellectual space to engage. And we wouldn't have these types of black and white statements of, well, women shouldn't get educated or women should only be educated or women should work and shouldn't work. Like these statements, I feel they just don't get us anywhere.
Yeah, very well said. So from now on, this is what we tell people when they tell us to not work. But how do you sleep though?
Soundly.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And now going back to a little bit, we're doing this the wrong way around. But obviously I know your story, but can you share a little bit about where you're from? What was the education like? What brought you to here today?
Oh, I feel like I'm a bit of a nomad now, so it's hard. I don't know where to start. I was born in Canada to South Asian parents. My father immigrated from India. My mother immigrated from Pakistan. And then when I was about 10, we moved to America. Grew up in, I would say, a culturally religious family. So, my parents didn't enforce any type of religious practice on me, but, I grew up in a house where my parents prayed and fasted, and I was encouraged to pray and fast and do all of those things. And, Ramadan was a very communal thing within my house, but prayers were kind of, maybe I was a bit more lax about them. And I went to university in America, and like a good South Asian, I wanted to be a doctor.
Of course.
So went straight into kind of biology and chemistry and physics. And, I wasn't enjoying my university kind of classes that I was taking, but I didn't really know what else to take at that point because it was just the path that was always laid out before me. And I remember the moment I got into Islamic studies, I was going into this kind of, I was coming out actually of the student center. And a girl that I knew from my chemistry class said, the Muslim Student Association meeting is happening. You should come back in. And I said, Muslims, it's not my scene. Like, I'm going to go study or go out with friends. And she said, just come, there's pizza, you'll meet some people. And, what's the worst that can happen, right? You get free pizza. So I went in and they were playing Islamic Jeopardy. Very intense. Yeah, I love that, right? It's so typical. And it was brothers versus sisters, of course, and the stakes were high. Whoever wins gets to lead the next MSA meeting. So stakes are very high at that point when you're Muslim and in university. And so it was going back and forth, and I grabbed my pizza. I sat in the back, didn't really want to socialize. And it came to the last question, who was the first Khalifa? And the MSA president at the time just said, you at the back, you're new, answer the question. And at this point, the brothers were all very frustrated that how could you give such a simple question on Islamic Jeopardy, right? Now the sisters are going to win. It's too easy. And of course, I didn't know the answer, which you could probably predict. Even though, I went to Islamic school, it should have come to me, even if I wasn't, engrossed in Islamic studies at the time. But I just ran a blank. And there was just such this moment of embarrassment that came over me. And I remember just the feeling of sitting there. And, whatever pizza I had, I threw in the garbage and I just left the room. And I started walking back to my dorms, and the dorms go under the library, the pathway goes under the library. So I remember walking past the library and then turning around and going back into the library and then just going to a computer and typing in Islam in the search bar. And then this catalog came up of 1 million hits or whatever, so 100,000 hits or something. And I was like, God, they've got a lot of books about Islam. What's going on? And then I just went to that section of the library. And I remember I was there till maybe 3-4 o'clock in the morning. And I remember the light and how it hit the books. I remember just, scanning through the books with my fingers. And it was it was such a mind-opening moment for me, because it was the volume of books itself just kind of shook me. But it was also the topics. There was philosophy, and there was medicine, and there was architecture, and there was women, and there was politics. And for me, I was it's a discipline. It's an entire world, right? And it's a world I can study. It's in a library. It's not just It's not just out there. It's not just what I've learned at home. And so that was the moment where I would go to my classes. I wasn't very good at paying attention. And then I would go to the library and I would just sit there and I would pull book after book and I would just read. And then after that, I moved to Jordan. I decided I wanted to learn Arabic. I lived in Jordan for a year. And then I lived in Egypt for a year. Then I went to the UK for a year. And then after that, I decided to do my PhD in Islamic studies. And what really ended up kind of getting me into the PhD and deciding to do the PhD and what I did is I came across this text from the 11th century. And this was like the height of people talking about, do we need an Islamic state, right? So we need to we need to reestablish the caliphate, right? This is the conversation circa kind of like 2009, 2010. And I came across this text when I was living in Egypt by a scholar, Abu Ma'ali al-Juwaini, who has this entire theorization of the caliphate collapsing in the 11th century, which up until this point I've understood as the golden age of Islam.
Right.
So I'm like, we're in the golden age. Why are we so bleak?
Yeah.
Why are we talking about the collapse of the caliphate? We're in the golden age. And then that was shocking. But then after that, he says, okay, then, you know, the ulama take over, the scholars take over. They bring order to society. And then he says, well, what if they all die? And he says, well, then people have the Quran. And he's like, what if the Quran disappears? What if people just stop memorizing it? And then what if the hadith disappears? And then what if your knowledge of Islam disappears? And he ends the book on this really somber note that basically the last moment of Islam, right, in Islamic knowledge is when the last person stops practicing it.
Right.
And I remember reading this thinking, how is a guy in the 11th century making this argument? Like everybody else is so, all like Western political thought I read is like, how do we get out of the state of nature? And this was, we have civilization. How do we go back to the state of nature? And that really, like, it was that moment where I was like, I can just study this for the rest of my life. And so he became kind of the person I did my PhD dissertation on. And then, you know, kind of my interest changed over time. But like what keeps me kind of excited is there's never been a moment where I haven't found that like text or that person or that idea that hasn't so deeply challenged me to rethink things. And I keep having those moments. And so I just keep doing Islamic studies, trying to solve whatever problems I find. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And now you're teaching it as well.
Now I'm teaching it. And every time, every time there's a new kind of problem that really captivates me, then that's what I end up spending the next few years figuring out.
I love that. Yeah, you're a nerd.
Yeah, I'm 100% a nerd.
Yeah, I can tell. Listen, we are kind of like running out of time, but Sohaira, there's one thing I would want to ask you is, obviously for me, the first time I entered this place, I saw, you just see the light, right? And the space and the light, and I loved it. And since then, I've been here many times and we've talked about this place many times and in details. But one thing that you haven't told me yet, and I'm really looking forward to find out today, is what is a memory that surprised you here?
Surprised me. So I would say the first Ramadan.
Okay.
So I've told you the story of my second Ramadan.
Okay.
I'll tell you the story of my first Ramadan. So Ramadan was shortly after we opened. So it was just maybe, I think not even 6-7 weeks after we opened, it was Ramadan. And as I said, it's, you know, for us, it's graduation. It's Super Bowl. It's the most important time for a masjid is Ramadan. And we had flown in multiple people to do sound checks because the masjid area, as you've seen, is very high up. So the acoustics can be very overpowering, but in a beautiful way. Like you want those acoustics in the masjid. So we had multiple people fly in for sound testing. The imam who was leading Ramadan that year, we also flew him in twice for sound testing.
Wow.
So we went through a lot of sound testing to make sure it was perfect. And the first Tarawih starts, and I was standing to the side, and I started seeing women covering their ears.
Oh, no.
And I just remember like my stomach just started churning. My heart dropped, and I was like, people are holding their ears while they're praying in a mosque, like literally covering their ears. And I was like, what did we do wrong? And, you know, you don't want to adjust the sound in the middle of prayer, right? Because then the imam also, that's very like jarring to, you know, all of a sudden hear a different sound. It's very disturbing. And so then I remember I started kind of going around, and I would see that it wasn't just one or two people, but a lot of women were doing this. But you couldn't
hear any difference?
It was loud.
Okay.
But I liked it, right? But other women weren't enjoying it. And so I was thinking, did we do something wrong? What's happening? This is not what we want to see on like the first night of Ramadan. And so I waited until, you know, we had the break, and then the imam, and he went to the office and he had a bit of a rest, and he was very particular about the sound as well. So I said, I'm going to go speak to the sheikh first and tell him that, you know, the sound is too loud and we need to adjust it. So I went in and I said, you know, we need to adjust the sound because, you know, the women are saying it's too loud and they're holding their ears. And he said, the sound is perfect. And I said, no, it's not. They're holding their ears. And he goes, that's because they've never heard the sound properly before. see the reaction. And I remember just looking at him and I was like, oh dear God, you're right.
Yeah.
They've never heard the sound properly before.
They're usually very far away.
We're so far away. Or, it's one speaker.
Yeah.
And he's been leading in like grand mosques his entire life. So he knows the sound
the acoustics, yeah.
is supposed to envelop you. It's supposed to like literally feel like it's piercing you at times.
Yeah.
And so for him, he's like, the sound is beautiful here. Like, what's the problem? And I remember it's the seriousness by which he said it. And he's like, it's just because they've never heard the sound properly before. Like, just this is a statement of fact. And I remember looking at him and thinking, you're right. But what do we do? Because they're covering their ears. And so he said, lower it and then increase it every day.
Get them used to it.
Get them used to it. Let's get them used to the full experience. And so that's what we did. So by the middle of Ramadan, we got to that point where it was back to the first day of Ramadan. But I remember like it really hit me because it was that moment where you realize this is why a place like Mujadilah should exist. And also that, you don't have to open up Muslim women mosques everywhere in the world. I'm not saying that, but to the extent that you have a women's prayer area, just make sure the sound is good.
I was just stunned for a minute and I was like, oh.
Right.
That's a good one. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing this with us.
Yeah.
And Sohaira, any parting message for any young Muslim women watching you today? How would you want to leave them?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I would say just be sincere. Find the people, find the service that speaks to you. Keep turning back to your faith. It is an anchor. Even when it feels like it's not an anchor, it is an anchor. And if it is the soil in which you plant everything, the tree will be good. And the world is expansive, so is Islam.
Wow. Well, Sohaira, thank you so much for today. As expected, this conversation was great. I wish we had more time. We'll take it offline now.
Yeah,
but
we'll continue at dinner.
We'll continue at dinner. But thank you so much for having me in the beautiful space.
Thank you for coming.
And if anyone is ever in Doha, please, not anyone, women.
If women are in Doha.
If you're in Doha, do come to visit Mujadilah. It's a beautiful space and it's free and accessible to everybody. So thank you once again for being here. And I'll see you soon, inshallah.
Take care.